Anyway, we are very blessed to be joined today by two very special guests who will be reporting on the 80th General Convention of the Episcopal Church, which was this past July in Baltimore. You'll be hearing all about General Convention if you don't already know from these two momentarily, but in brief, General Convention is a triennial. It is every 3 years, a convention of the whole Episcopal Church where they pass legislation and vote on important resolutions and take care of much other important business besides. So today we are joined by Bill Powel, who is, as is Dianne Audrick Smith, who's joining him, two of our delegates to General Convention this year, deputies to General Convention. And Bill, as I'm sure you all know, is one of our parishioners, also is the Canon to the Ordinary and Chancellor of our Diocese of Ohio. Dianne Audrick Smith is a friend of St. Paul's, a member of St. Andrew's, Cleveland, and a member of our standing committee here in Ohio, as well as a member of the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church. So without further ado, please welcome Dianne and Bill.
Thank you very much. Tell me if I'm getting too far away or too loud, as I was told during the service. I don't know what's going on there, but I'm glad it was fixed. I'm going to borrow this Dianne. Yep. And so Bishop Hollingsworth does every year a sort of Episcopal Polity 101. And I thought before we get into the details of what occurred at the General Convention, it might be helpful just to understand and recall, for those of you who are Episcopal Church wonks, that the Episcopal Church really is built on a model, a shared governance model, that takes parts of its being from the Episcopal side of things, which is where the authority is vested in bishops, and the Presbyterian, which is a group of individuals who gather in larger and larger groups with more and more authority, called synods. So we have in the Episcopal Church a bicameral legislature of both bishops and deputies that gathers every 3 years. And it's quite similar to how you would imagine the people from the 1780s came up with this model, because they were working on another governmental model at the time. So who goes to General Conventions? Follow carefully this animated. So on the right is a parish, and the C's are you all, they're communicants. The communicants are electing the vestry in that green dot, and the vestry elects the wardens and the rector, with involvement from the bishop, of course. So at the annual meeting of the parish, the deputies to General Convention are elected once every 3 years. This year we're going to be doing on an accelerated cycle because of the 2-year time frame. And so those delegates are part of the diocesan convention, where they sit as delegates along with all the clergy, and they in turn elect the bishop and the standing committee, the diocesan council, which acts as the vestry, if you will, between the annual conventions of the diocese. The trustees of the Diocese of Ohio have responsibility for property. And then the standing committee, the trustees, and as I said, the deputies to General Convention are elected. 4 lay and 4 clergy are elected. So that's a little background. That was a slide by of governance at the Episcopal Church, but that sets the stage for Dianne.
So as you know, this year was an interesting year because a lot of the guidelines and the time frame of General Convention were governed by COVID. So General Convention was delayed a year, and so was held instead of 2021, 2022. The time frame was also shortened from 8 days to 4 days. And that shortened time frame, though, allowed us to complete the things that we needed to complete, but it also meant that in order to protect those who attended, we really shrank the number of attendees. There have been up to as many as 10,000 people who attend General Convention. That includes all of those who are members of the voting bodies, the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops. But it also means that there are a lot of visitors. ECW attends, there are a lot of vendors who attend. People may come for a day or a couple of days, but none of those visitors were able to attend this time. So we really have a shortened convention, but also restricted those who attended convention to 4 clergy, 4 lay deputies, and 1 alternate in each of the orders. So no vendors, no Episcopal Church women, no visitors, very limited opportunities for gathering. Even our services each morning were held via Zoom. So each house had its own service, and the sermon was piped in. But because of great planning, all the essential legislation was passed, the budget was passed, and elections were held. So am I pushing the red button?
Yeah, you push the arrow to the right.
To the right.
Okay.
Is that me or is that you? That's me. The business of the 80th General Convention. We elected a new president and vice president, and we elected other offices of the Episcopal Church. So the trustees of the church pension group were elected, the executive council or the vestry of the General Convention between General Conventions, and that's the body to which I was elected. Essential changes to the Constitution and canons were made at this particular General Convention, particularly as it related to terms of office. So terms of office usually relate to 3-year cycles, so changes had to be made to relate to 2 years, to this current 2-year cycle. And approval of the budget for 2023, 2024, and legislation that is needed to allow the church to continue until the next General Convention, which will be held in Lexington, Kentucky.
So we talked about the 2 different houses of the General Convention. The House of Bishops is, as it says there, 300 bishops. There are bishops from 112 dioceses across the Episcopal Church, and that includes not just the United States, but includes Taiwan, it includes Ecuador, it includes Venezuela, Colombia, Haiti, Dominican Republic. Let's see, what else am I missing? Honduras, Virgin Islands,
Cuba.
Cuba, I was going to say, that's the newest one. Dianne was actually on the committee at the previous General Convention, which brought Cuba in, brought the resolution to the floor that made Cuba a member of the Diocese of the Episcopal Church again after it was severed back in the 1960s.
Yes.
Yeah.
During the around the Cuban Missile Crisis time.
So the diocesan bishop, and that is the Bishop Hollingsworth is. Suffragan bishops are those that do not have the authority the same way that diocesan bishops do. Bishop Williams, before he retired, was a bishop suffragan. Assisting bishops and provisional bishops. Provisional bishop is someone who is serving between bishops in a sense. There is a bishop provisional for the dioceses of Eastern and Western Michigan, Prince Singh, who will actually be in Cleveland as the chaplain to the diocesan convention, and he will lead us in prayer prior to the balloting, and he will preach at the Friday night convention Eucharist. As Dianne mentioned, 900 deputies, 9 provinces of the Episcopal Church, and their geographic. There's also Europe. There's a convocation of Europe, so there's one diocese that represents all the Anglican churches in various capitals throughout Europe. And as Dianne mentioned, we have the celebrity presiding bishop, Michael Curry. But the House of Bishops was originally met with the House of Deputies because there weren't any American bishops, and it was the Bishop of Scotland that actually consecrated the first American bishop in the 1780s. And 300 bishops can vote. The chair of that body is Bishop Curry, and Mary Gray Reeves, who used to be the Bishop of El Camino Real, California, is now the vice chair. Go ahead. Oh, and you've seen these guys before. Bishop Hollingsworth and Bill Purcell. Bishop Purcell was the dean of the cathedral before becoming the Bishop of Chicago, and when he retired from that, he came back and is an assisting bishop. So until this year, he was doing visitations and helping confirmations and so forth. Bishop Williams is still active. He is helping out with visitations, but all, or I should say both Bishop Purcell and Bishop Williams are going to be retiring at the end of this year. Next slide.
So the House of Deputies. The House of Deputies has a president who was elected and a vice president. The president of the House of Deputies who was elected at the last General Convention is Julia Ayala Harris from the Diocese of Oklahoma. She is the first Latina and the youngest, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, president of the House of Deputies. And Reverend Deacon Rachel Tabor Hamilton from the Chicano First Nations is the vice president of the House of Deputies. And as you may know, they have to be of opposite orders. So Julia is lay, Rachel Tabor Hamilton is clergy. Deputies. So deputies and delegates. Any of you who have ever heard Gay Clark Jennings talk about the difference between delegates and deputies? Deputies are fully independent representatives. They are elected by the diocese to exercise their own authority based on the information that they have about the issues and the people about which they vote. As opposed to delegates, which generally have to get information and then vote the conscience or the will of the body that they represent. There are 8 per diocese, 4 clergy and 4 lay, and then usually 4 alternates, clergy and lay.
And let's meet them right now.
And let's meet them right now.
So, yeah, this was the group that was at the convention. Everyone is running again on this slide except for Reverend Percy Graham. And next slide. The alternates, Dennis Coughlin is here. He was an alternate. But again, as Diane mentioned, because of the limited in-person presence, Dennis wasn't able to join us, but participated in the preparation and knowing and understanding and that's something I should mention just for a moment. Leading up to the convention, there are many reports that are generated by the bodies that are appointed to bring issues to the General Convention. Our responsibility as a deputation was to read all of that and then report to our deputation. I don't know how many times, Diane, we met. It was probably a half dozen or more. And each person was responsible for bringing forward what happened with the Truth-Telling Commission. What went on with the Standing Commission on Structured Governance, Constitution, and Canons? Tell us what we need to know before we have to make a vote on these things. So that was part of what our job was as a deputation when we started a year and a half prior. And we had extra time because there was a pandemic. Right. And clergy deputies, and Brian Wilbert, who was an interim here, was in attendance. Sue Ann was not able to go at the last minute, so Ann Young was our lay deputy alternate.
So in preparation for General Convention, committees and interim bodies. So generally at General Convention, committees meet to prepare resolutions that are voted on at General Convention. But because of the shortened time frame, committees began meeting generally about the 1st of January, around the first part of January. So instead of General Convention really being 4 days, General Convention was actually 6 months. So the committee on which I served, which was World Mission, we met, I think, about 4 or 6 times. Some of the committees, those committees on social justice issues, met even more frequently to perfect resolutions so that when we came to General Convention, the resolutions, the language would generally be in a status that would be able to be voted on, or perhaps just tweaked minimally. Work that is often done at General Convention was done prior to General Convention. Bill continues to serve on Constitution and Canons. And as I mentioned, I served on the commission. So in order to make this whole process of a shortened General Convention work, a lot of work was done early on. And the success of that effort really suggested to the General Convention office that maybe we need to take a look at doing something like that in the future, so that General Convention may not be 4 days, it might be longer than that. But we have an opportunity to do work kind of along the way and have resolutions that are passed on the consent calendar, which means that they're passed in whole, in chunks, which is part of how we were able to get this business done so very quickly. Most resolutions were submitted, reviewed, and prepared for action prior to the start. And as I mentioned, provided a new way of doing business for us that is being looked at now in preparation for General Convention 2024 in Louisville. The business of General Convention. So we adopted a balanced $100.5 million budget with a number of resolutions tied to the presiding officer's working group on truth-telling, reckoning, and healing. So one of the things, how many of you receive Episcopal News Service emails? Okay. The Episcopal News Service is one of the ways of getting information about the church on a sort of a regular basis. So Episcopal nerds get ENS articles, we at least get one a day, and we get ENS kind of things from different sources, so we get 3 or 4 a day. But you will see over time that there will be more information coming out to you about how this group is being addressed. The presiding officers, the president of the House of Deputies, and Bishop Curry, the presiding bishop, established a working group to look at issues of racial justice in the church. A series of resolutions came to the body at General Convention about setting up a separate organization that reports only to the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies. And so the Executive Council now is beginning to, has asked the status of that and has encouraged the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies to begin to appoint people to that body. So there are a number of resolutions, a number of suggested activities. If you're interested, I have a copy of the report. It's not there, it's in there, with me, but it's a very in-depth report. That body met for about a year, and there are several resolutions that were voted on at General Convention in relation to that. So Resolution A-125 provided startup funding for that Episcopal Coalition for Racial Equity and Justice. Resolution A-048 abolished the old way that we did budgeting, and we are in the process now of establishing a new way of doing budgeting so that it's not repetitive and confusing, and streamline the process to make it easier to accommodate funding requests. Often what happens at General Convention is you have a budget, you pass a budget, but there are these resolutions that say, oh, we want more money to do blah, 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 blah. Then you got to look back, kind of figure out, is there enough money? Well, we're trying to develop a process now that allows for some of that and makes it easier to fund some of the unfunded resolutions that are passed.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, one of the things that happened several years ago, there was a task force called Reimagining the Episcopal Church, or TREC. And one of the streamlined solutions that Dianne just described was, instead of having a group of lay people who are not familiar with the church start 6 months before the General Convention and come up with a budget in 3 years, that responsibility has now been transitioned away from the program, budget, and finance committee. And now it is all executive council, so there will be a continuous monitoring and familiarity with that. The other thing I wanted to say, how many watched the Episcopal priest on Jeopardy? I got to know him on Zoom because he was the secretary of the legislative committee in which I served. And he could quote the canons without even looking it up. So I am not surprised at all that he knew all this stuff that he knew. And he only started wearing his collar on day 3, which was, but he did at least. That's good. All right. Just a side note here. One of the biggest issues I think that has been bubbling, percolating for a while is how does the church handle revisions to the Book of Common Prayer? It's almost been as long from 1928 to 1979 as it's been since 1979. The difference, I think, is that there are a lot of people that like the book. And in the meantime, however, same-sex rights and other, liturgies that have been experimented with and adopted, the Book of Common Prayer is more of a virtual document. But there are those who want to hold on to the book, and so, to try to get over that book hurdle, it would be really tough. So, we have to give credit. I don't think it gets enough airtime, but it was Bishop Hollingsworth in the House of Bishops who was able to bridge a via media for this process, which will maintain the book itself, but they recognize that the Book of Common Prayer is more than that, as approved by the General Convention, which is the only way you can approve changes to the book. So we have a process of reading at 2 different General Conventions things that require constitutional approval, like the prayer book. So we've done one, and we'll do it again. So, I wanted just to mention that. Go ahead.
A lot of time was taken at General Convention with addressing issues of social justice. And some of those are related to the Church's role in systemic racism. So A125 is a resolution that dealt with the voluntary Episcopal Coalition for Racial Equity and Justice among dioceses and congregations. You'll remember that I mentioned there was a task force that the presiding officers established. They had a report. This resolution implements the recommendations of the report and then provided funding for it. A127 pledges $2.5 million over the next biennium, 2 years, to further the commitment to investigating the Church's role in the indigenous boarding schools. Whether you read the ENS articles or not, I know that you've heard a lot about the indigenous boarding schools in Canada and the problems there, finding the graves of children on some of the former sites of indigenous boarding schools. Well, the Episcopal Church also had an involvement with indigenous boarding schools here in the United States. And so that money goes to uncovering what our relationship has been with those boarding schools here. A086 allocated funding for the development and support of programs related to eco-justice, environmental racism, alleviating environmental burdens on indigenous communities, and providing training and financial aid and other resources. A052 clarifies the mandate of Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism and Reconciliation. Executive Council held its first meeting in Phoenix 2 weeks ago, and that is one of the areas that we have very clearly said we need to get involved in more deeply, especially those of us who are new to Executive Council, starting with our next meeting in February. C05A requires Executive Council to respond to the Church's racial audit. And again, that's something that starting in February we will be very significantly involved in as Executive Council.
We talked a little bit about the House of Deputies, but I didn't want the moment to pass without recognizing that Gay Jennings serve a 9-year term plus 1. So she really was involved for a very long time and was recognized for her many contributions. You know, a woman of the, actually she sat as a candidate in the Ordinary a while ago before she went out to that role. And as I think Diane mentioned, the Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton is the first Indigenous and ordained woman to serve in the House as a Vice President. Next slide. So I mentioned Cuba came in to the Episcopal Church last year. The Diocese of Fort Worth, which was decimated by the secession of many of the churches that left the Episcopal Church, left many of the parishes, following the Jane Robinson's ordination and issues of human sexuality. And so that church really struggled, and ultimately the Texas courts sided with the disability churches. So it really didn't have much left. So the Episcopal Church in North Texas is now part of the Diocese of Texas, and North Texas was Fort Worth. And so now they are combined. Diocese of Texas is one of the most resourced dioceses in the world. And that was approved by the General Convention.
As some of you may recall, last year at our diocesan convention, the Diocese of Ohio, a resolution R4, which memorialized a number of the resolutions that the Union of Black Episcopalians was putting forward in regards to social justice issues. And these are some of the 17 resolutions. They all had some action. Most of them were supported or had action that superseded them. For instance, it's actually on the next page, but funding for the historically Black colleges and universities, of which there are 2, St. Augustine's in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Voorhees in Denmark, South Carolina. Additional funding for the chaplaincies was approved. Equity and health outcomes was referred to the Office of Government Relations. Beloved community funding has been increased. The internalized oppression curriculum funding from the Office of, used to be Black Ministries, is now the Office of African Descent Ministries, has been included in the budget. We're working towards equity in awarding Episcopal Church grants. Voter suppression was carried over. Mass incarceration in private prisons were referred to the Office of Government Relations. Removing the name of William Porcher DeBose, a Confederate officer and chaplain, was removed from lesser feasts and fasts. The inclusion of the Right Reverend Barbara Harris Feast Day. Normally, when someone dies and we want to establish a feast day for them, it requires their death by 50 years. So in order to accommodate the request for the resolution for Bishop Barbara, we will be celebrating her consecration day on February 11th. So I ask you to look forward to a service that will be held at Trinity Cathedral that will recognize the Right Reverend Barbara Harris and Reverend Absalom Jones. Saturday, February 11th, 11 o'clock, Trinity. Lift Every Voice and Sing as a national hymn was concurred. The use of sacred ground. Some of you have been involved in sacred ground circles. We continue to use that and strengthen and build that throughout the Episcopal Church. The Emmett Till anti-lynching bill was passed by Congress this year. Inclusion of Juneteenth on the church's calendar was also approved, and requiring action on the racial audit. We will continue to look at the racial audit of the Episcopal Church and the actions that need to be taken. Oh, and there were actually some other things that I forgot to mention. There were some other social justice issues that were addressed as well. Reproductive rights, including abortion access. There is a request for relocation of the 81st General Convention from Louisville. That resolution was rejected but it forced us as General Convention to focus on creating an environment to make it feel safe for all, because the state of Kentucky, because of the rules about abortion in the state of Kentucky, which Ohio is in a similar place. Family leave policies were approved that offer to pay family leave to lay and clergy through the denominational health plan. That is an urging but not requiring. That was approved. The gun violence epidemic was recognized. During the General Convention, those of you who had a chance to view it on live stream, you may have noted that the bishops against gun violence had a rally. They walked from the convention center down to the port and spoke out against gun violence. There were a number of us that supported that rally, including Bishop Mark was there. And then finally, the entire House of Deputies rose to stand in silent witness to the persons who were killed at St. Stephen's in Vestavia Hills, Alabama. You may recall that there was a potluck dinner, I think, being held at that Episcopal Church in Alabama, and people were killed there I think just prior to the start, or maybe just at the beginning of General Convention. So we bore silent witness to those who have been killed. So those are some of the other issues that we addressed in General Convention. So now.
We are so proud of how to have Dianne as part of the Executive Council. She received the highest number of votes of anyone running for that office.
I'm not sure who this question should be directed to, but I was interested that the Executive Council now will basically form the budget. That was what I heard. And I'm wondering how they will get, since so many things that require action require money, how they will be able to listen to and hear what the budget should be without these various divisions, which I'm sure make it very cumbersome, but probably a little more democratic in one sense.
So if I told you how that exactly is going to happen, I would be telling you nothing. But I will tell you this, there are 4 standing committees of Executive Council. A Finance Committee is one of them. And of course, at every Executive Council, the Chief Financial Officer is always present. So there is a staff. I mean, in all of the things that we do, it's well-resourced in terms of staff. So it's not like you're starting from scratch with nothing. There is a budget. So what's being established is really the process of how we establish a budget. But we're not starting from scratch. We're really changing the way that we manage that. But there's, I mean, if you would like, I can send you the link to the budget. I mean, so there's already something there. This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So we're changing how we do it, but we're not changing the it. There's a history of budgets from before. There's, all of the budgets roll up. I mean, it's the budget it's the making of the soup, but the ingredients are there and have been there for years. Yes.
Of the 100 million plus budget, is there a resource that has maybe a pie chart that breaks that into 5 to 8 mutually exclusive categories?
Probably. As I said, I'm sure that the link to the budget actually has that. I can send you all the link to the budget, but I'm sure that it's sliced and diced in all the ways that you could probably imagine.
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, I think Bill, you mentioned the next convention is in Lexington, and Dianne said twice Louisville, which...
Did I say Lexington right now?
It's a little,
Sorry. It's one of those cities that
it's an L.
And it might be helpful to explain to people what a racial audit is, for those who don't know.
So,
You want me to start with that?
Yes, because I actually, the diocese participated in a racial audit. We as a parish did not.
So Dianne alluded to this. It is really an exploration of how the Episcopal Church in its history was, how it might have been involved in the structures that led to racism, that led to slavery, and so it is really an uncovering or a research project to go back, and Dianne mentioned the diocesan audit. We at the diocese, the Diocesan Council, has been considering doing the same sort of digging into our own history to find out whether there are issues we need to talk about and come clean about, and maybe even try to repair the breach about. One of the things that can be done also is a parish audit in that same way. But I think with the diocesan audit, we're going to lead with that and then provide some opportunities and tools for parishes to do the same. Is that helpful to answer your question?
And obviously, every diocese didn't conduct a racial audit. Several did. I want to say Maryland.
Yes.
Some of the dioceses in the east did.
New York.
Okay, Maryland, New York, maybe Connecticut. But yeah, so over time, hopefully more will. So it's not just the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the enslavement of Black people is not just a Southern thing. Those of you who get the Episcopal News Service may have read the article about a church in Connecticut where, I saw the video yesterday, where an enslaved person was buried in the basement of the church in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so, and throughout Connecticut, the Episcopal Church has a history of its rectors owning enslaved people. So it's uncovering that history through the course of time that the Episcopal Church was involved.
William.
Thank you both for your very hard work for our faith. With the one-year delay due to COVID, did a lot of Episcopal officers' term of office expire? Since there was a last 3 years between one general convention and the other, were the people elected until for just a 3-year term?
Yes.
You're going to ask who?
And so we changed the canons, so it's not a triennial term, it's till the next general convention meets to address that problem. So there were...
The President of the House of Deputies, the Vice President of the House of Deputies, their term is now a 2-year term. So they stand for election at each general, those positions are elected at each general convention.
And with the one-year delay, why not just push back the next convention for a full 3 years? Why try to cram it in, as it were, for just 2 years?
That is probably a financial answer, because there were commitments made to cancel the convention in Louisville after making the commitment. They do these out 3, 6, 9 years kind of thing, so it's probably that reason. So I hand here. Yes.
One of the slides mentioned the working group on truth telling.
Repeat the question.
Yeah.
One of the slides mentioned the working group on truth telling, and I was curious if that dealt with racial issues or indigenous school issues.
The presiding officer's working group on truth-telling, reckoning, and healing dealt with the church's role in racism in the Episcopal Church. And those of you who had an opportunity to hear the meet and greets also found out that Elaine Thomas was a member of that working group. So there were about 30 people on that working group that worked for about a year about a year, I think. And then issued a report with a number of recommendations, very detailed recommendations of what could be done at each level in the church to uncover our role in our complicity in racism in this church. And so, yes, that is what it had to do with, and there's like a 40-page report that outlines that. And so A125, the resolution that I mentioned earlier, is a resolution to fund the committee to deal with that, the commission to deal with that. And it's going to be funded as a separate entity. So this is the first time that the Episcopal Church is actually creating an entity outside of itself that only reports to the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies about this work.
Yes.
On a similar note, the $2.5 million, if I understand correctly, for the boarding school for Indigenous students, the $2.5 million is to investigate the Episcopalian's role. Was there a discussion, or is this how it always goes? We have to investigate first, as opposed to just saying, we're going to acknowledge that we had some role in it, and we're going to take $2.5 million, we're going to donate it right now to Indigenous people who could use that money, as opposed to the research of what happened in the past.
So part of truth-telling is understanding what the truth is. And you can't understand that without identifying the truth. So rather than just saying we're going to fix it by giving money, we need to know what that it is that we're fixing.
Do you anticipate that in the future then that will lead toward reparations, or like, is that typical?
I don't know. I don't know. And I think once the truth-telling and uncovering what the relationship has been, then the next steps will be determined.
Go ahead. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned something about the common prayer and updates, and how does that, can you say more about that? What that was like in the shoe and in our prayer?
What it means is that it's in process, but the idea would be that, and I think the slide, I was reading from it, this is not really good. Dianne did these slides, but they're great. So, Article 10 of the Constitution would say, Book of Common Prayer is those liturgical forms and other texts authorized by General Convention. So the liturgies are going to be expanded the menu for people to use, as opposed to having this hodgepodge. Has it been approved by General Convention, or is it just an experimental one? Are you allowed to use it? There's this kind of a patchwork right now of these kinds of liturgies. So the idea would be to create sort of a virtual hub of approved liturgies. And that's the goal, I think.
So the book in addition to...
Precisely. So I'm going to have to scoot because I'm up for another service. But any more questions come on? Dianne has all the answers anyway.
And I have plenty of time.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.